welcome back. My name is Shannon and I'm the owner and creator here at Knotted Threads Co. As is usually the case for a video like this, I'm here to present to you my newest pattern called the donut hole. So the donut hole offers two construction options. The first one is the Royal Companion, which is a pieced version that offers a connector to turn it into a keychain pouch, and a more simplistic version that is not pieced together called the Biscuit. And I'm sure some of you are asking yourself, but why? Well, because I was in a moment where I needed some fun. I think many of us who are a little artistic tend to find ourselves sometimes in creative ruts, or we just need a bit of a refresher. And so sometimes it's good to take a couple steps back, find something fun, enjoy it, get creative with it, and then jump back into that bigger project. That's exactly where I found myself just a couple months ago. And so I took a break, I did some market research, I did a lot of brainstorming, and poof, we got our donut holes. Now, as the name implies, it's meant to be a fun make. It's something where you get the opportunity to meet functionality with fun. Think about using it as a small sports-related first aid kit, feminine product storage, adult snack storage, chapstick storage, even a fancy gift card holder. Okay, so it's fun and it's functional, but is it difficult? Valid question. The answer is it's an intermediate pattern. There are next to no straight edges in this pattern, just a couple of them. So that means you have to be intentional when it comes to aligning things. You have to cut notches, you have to sew on rounded edges, but it's really not that difficult. After your first one, I promise you're going to be ready to cut your next one. Speaking of cutting things out, that's one of the challenges of working with any sort of a circular pattern. You want to cut the most accurate circle you can, and I get that. So it was a priority for me to make sure that the template files, the 3D printer template files for you to print your own at home, were also available at the time of this pattern release. You can find the link to that in the description below if you have access to a 3D printer, either yours or a friend or family member's, or even your local library. This is a great way to get the most accurate cut available to you in a really affordable way. All of our templates offer filleted edges, center markings, stabilizer placement guides, and other pattern marking reference lines. Another option is to purchase those templates from me directly. Now let's say you don't have access to a 3D printer and 3D printed templates or acrylic templates are not in your budget. Also valid. Included in your purchase are SVG files. Now these aren't your mama's SVG files, okay? I've done some extra work and I've incorporated some extra features into the SVG files, including pre-notched pieces. That way, when it comes time to notch your edges, you don't have to do it. It's already done for you. Talk about a time saver. I spent some extra time so you didn't have to. You want to hear more about the donut holes? There we are again. Valid. Now, although I call it over-engineered, because it is, it's still just a simple pouch. It's just a plain exterior with no additional pockets and a solid compartment interior with wings. As you can see, it does have some gaps on the side, so I wouldn't call it a coin pouch, but it's great for all the things I mentioned at the beginning of the video. I'm not sure what else there is to say about these fun pouches, other than I can't wait to see what you come up with. So let's get to sewing. So as usual, I like to start by going over all of the materials and the prep work that will need to be done. Now, because this pattern has two options, I'm going to be working kind of simultaneously on these two options throughout the entire video. So when the time comes, there will be bookmarks in the description below that will tell you that will link you directly to the start of the section that maybe you need to skip to. So if you're following along in the pattern, you'll know when you need to skip ahead. I'll mention it here in the video, but also there will be links to that in the video description. So I am staying on theme for my makes. So this is some more Dungeon Crawler Carl themed makes here. And so in the pattern, I kind of went full donut vibe. And then here on the video tutorial, I'm going Carl vibe. So I have my exterior pieces. This is from Indo Love Creation. I don't remember the name of this. I think it's their Kaya line. It's almost like a matte suede texture, but it's not really fuzzy or anything. And so I've done that for the exterior for both options. The lining for both options is a quilt cotton that it's a thin one. I ordered it from somewhere on Etsy, but it was the design I needed. And then for my wings, I'm doing Essex linen, which if you watched any of my tutorials before, you know how much I love Essex linen. And I also wanted to try it for the video because this is a material that does fray easily. I wanted to just see how it would behave on the wings, and so we're going to learn together. I have my number 5 zipper tape. I also have my number 5 zipper pulls. I believe they also came from Into Love Creation, and this is a Dungeon Color Crawl reference, of course. So you will also need some 3/4 inch hardware for your connector for the Royal Companion version. And so you have a couple options here. I'm not making it zoom. My camera's doing that on its own, so that's fun. You could use a standard D-ring here, a standard swivel snap hook. You can use this hybrid version, which I found on Amazon and I really like. It's like a cross between a D-ring and a circle gate ring. This one's technically just over 3/4 of an inch. The thicker your material, the better that's gonna look when it's all said and done. And you can use a circle gate ring. The thing to keep in mind with a circle gate ring though is that when I tell you you need a 1 inch inner diameter here, I really mean it. You have to make sure that's what you're ordering. When you order it, you have to be mindful of that when it comes to circle rings, because that's going to measure that distance between the middle of the inside of your ring. And so that means that below that midpoint, you're going to hit where your material is actually going to rest. And that means it needs to be smaller. That's going to match whatever is being called for in the pattern, not in this midpoint. And so let's say that the outer diameter was an inch and this inner diameter was closer to 3/4 of an inch. That means that in the middle of this hardware is where the connector is going to sit, and then that means that you're going to have a big gap of empty space here on the connector, and we don't want that. So just make sure that this inner diameter of your gate ring is 1 inch. So getting into some of the prep work and the stabilizers, the main stabilizers you're going to use are Decaville Light and Decaville Heavy. There is a layer of Decaville Heavy under this layer of Decaville Light on the exterior, and that's going to be for both options. So that's the Biscuit, and this is the Royal Companion. You can't really see it, but there are 2 layers of stabilizer here. I don't have you do any woven interfacing on your lining pieces whatsoever. So the lining does have a single layer of Decaville Heavy for the Biscuit, but because we have a lot more going on here with the Royal Companion, I do have you kind of take one of those stabilizer pieces here that would normally be on the exterior, and I have you put it on the lining just so that we still have a little bit of stabilization happening there, and all of the stuff that's going on the exterior kind of has a little bit of an extra barrier from the lining. So it's a little confusing. I know you will probably get a little confused about that in the pattern as you kind of see me flip-flop back and forth between photographing both lining pieces. But if at the end of the day this is too confusing for you, you can always put it on the spine of the Royal Companion. So that one has a single layer of Decaville Heavy on it. And if you really wanted to, you could add a bit of Decaville Light, or not if you wanted to, if you felt like you needed to for your material, if it has a lot of stretch or you think it will wear down over time. I do call for a little strip of Decaville Light that goes in the center of your connector here. So as you saw, you also need to draw some lines on the wrong side on the stabilizers of your materials. And so I'll walk you through what those are now. So on the back of all of your stabilizers, you need to draw some center lines. So for your Royal Companion, you're just going to need to draw a vertical center line. And then you'll draw this line here that's from the stabilizer edge. It's where you're going to be measuring down from that stabilizer edge. You have some other lines on the lining. That's going to be for both versions, both the Royal Companion and the Biscuit. And then on the main panel, the full main panel exterior, you're also going to need to draw some lines here on the stabilizer. And I did forget to draw this line on the back of this lining, so we'll do that. So all of these center lines that we're drawing on all these pieces are really important. The thing when it comes to sewing something that's circular, you have no flat edges in which to orient yourself to make sure everything is aligned nicely. And so that can be a challenge when you need everything to be symmetrical, especially when you're piecing it together with something like the Royal Companion, but also on the Biscuit too, where you need to make sure everything is perfectly aligned and not semi-off. That way when you close it, it's not askew, and when you close it, everything's nice and flat. So that's what we're going for, and that is why we're drawing all these center lines. On your pattern pieces, there are center markings on all of them so that you can very easily notch those out of your pattern pieces and mark them on your pieces like I have here on these exterior or lining pieces. You'll see tiny little notches, and they are tiny little marks, and they're very helpful for getting everything nicely aligned, not only your stabilizers, but also later on. They're very important. So make sure that you're doing that with permanent ink so that if you press it at any point in this process, you don't remove it. I want to go in a little more detail on some of these other pieces and kind of how we drew our lines and oriented everything for the stabilizers. So for this one, I have you measure in 3/8 of an inch from these flat edges here and draw a line. And when you do that from all of these edges, not from this inside of this curved edge here, but from these straight edges, you will create a rectangle. And this stabilizer piece should sit perfectly in that. If that's too confusing for you and you happen to have a 3D printer or the templates, you'll see that on the template, the 3D printed templates, the stabilizer fits perfectly in there, so you can trace this inner edge. And that is the same for some of the other pieces as well, such as the main panel, your lining pieces here, and your full main panel. So these can be really helpful. They are available on my website. They are printed to order. I highly recommend them because it just makes life way easier when you're dealing with a round pattern. Believe me, I get it. When it comes to your connector piece, you'll see we have drawn kind of these curved lines. And if you can see, then what this is it is just a replica of this outer edge traced here to meet this center line. So you would just align the top and bottom edges of your connector piece here with that center line and trace it, and then do the same on the other side. And then you'll have those lines that you need there. Next up is your length of zipper tape here. So I have drawn some center markings. You can see them right there. Just little dashes. They're about 1/8 of an inch into the zipper tape, and I did use removable ink for this. And you can also see that along the length of my zipper tape, I've also drawn a line. That is a 1/4 inch line using removable ink all along the length of my zipper tape. This is just a reference line. If you're using white zipper tape and all you have is red pen, red removable ink, or something like that, and you're just afraid it's not going to come out at some point, then by all means, don't use it. It's not that big of a deal. This edge will be essentially hidden anyway. It's just something for you to kind of reference to see how you did when you applied the zipper. It is not absolutely necessary. It's just good for people like me who like to kind of double check their work as they go and adjust on the fly. So the last bit of the prep work section focuses on the wings here. And so this is what you get if you use the SVG files. Everything is already cut and mirrored for you. And so you don't have to worry about accidentally cutting something the wrong orientation and wasting your materials. When it comes to patterns like this, when it comes to cutting 2 one way and 2 mirrored, somehow I always end up doing 3 one way and 1 another. And so I just kept messing it up even as a designer, so I decided to have you cut them first this way, which is without any of the edge trimming at all. That will then create those mirrored options, or those mirrored versions. So in your pattern, you will have this piece right here, and it is called the wing trimming guide. And so what you will do is you're going to align this straight edge with the center markings on your pattern piece. And what should happen is that the corners of that pattern piece should align with the corners of the edge trimming guide, and you will trace this new edge onto your pattern piece like so. And so I have you orient your pieces like this so that you would do that, and then the next one you would flip it upside down and do it this way, then flip it to the left and do it this way, and then flip it up and trace it this way. I know that that is like way more meticulous than most people like to be, but if you orient it this way, you see how these two are pointing down like I instruct you in the pattern, then you aren't duplicating the wrong edge anywhere. And so when we put them all together, we'll see that we have two that will be trimmed on the right and two that will be trimmed on the left like this. And so when you get done doing that, you will have these edges right here, which again, if you use the SVG files, you'll already have this done for you. So again, after you've drawn those lines, you'll trim those edges back, and then those will be your perfectly mirrored pattern pieces. For the main panel prep, you're going to need either your full main panel if you're making the biscuit, or your two main panels if you're making the royal companion. If you're making the biscuit, click the link in the description to skip ahead to that section of the video. If you are making the royal companion, stay right here. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to kind of angle your scissors so that they would stop cutting about a quarter or an eighth of an inch away from the edge of the stabilizer. And you want to angle it so that you are kind of pointing directly at that corner of the stabilizer like that. I'm gonna do that on both sides. I never really do a great job of this. I just know we need to remove more material from this corner than we need to remove from any other part of this exterior. So I start off by doing this. I make them way bigger than we normally would for the rest of the rounded edge. And then alongside either side of each notch, we're gonna cut more notches, because we really need to remove that excess material so that it fits nicely into this section right here. It really needs to condense down to be a nice smooth section. So if you see, if we fold this all over and we kind of get it all placed nicely, we will have a pretty much nice and smooth corner there. And of course, all that's going to be sewn over, so it will look seamless for the most part. So now that we've got the notches cut, if you're using double-sided tape for this next step, you can apply 1/8 inch double-sided tape all around this outer edge of the stabilizer here, just as it's shown in the pattern. And I like to just kind of put it about halfway between this line we drew on the stabilizer and the edge of the stabilizer, so that I don't put it where these notches are kind of nest against each other, because I want that area free for the glue. So I tend to apply it on the outside edge. I'm actually going to use glue for this step. This gathering technique that I use for the exterior or for pretty much all the notched edges here, I find it just easier to use glue, and I get a better result when I use glue versus when I use double-sided tape, even the good double-sided tape. So you can use what you want to, but that is what I'm going to use for this tutorial on both the biscuit and the royal companion. So now we've got our notches done and our double-sided tape is applied. What you are going to do is baste around this entire rounded edge here. You're going to start and stop at each edge of your notches, and you're going to leave long thread tails. Now there's a couple really important things to make note of when you're basting here. The purpose for this basting is to then pull those thread tails and gather the notches that we'll cut after we baste. And so because of that, if your tension is too tight, it's going to be very hard to pull that gathering or to pull those thread tails. also, if your stitches are too close together, that's going to just be so much kind of woven loops and threads that you're going to have to pull through, and you really don't want that. So again, the loosest tension that your machine can handle for your materials and the longest stitch length you have at your disposal. Can you hand baste this? Absolutely. If your machine just isn't kind of set up for basting this single layer of material, then absolutely feel free to use to do a hand sewing needle and do your basting stitch. So you also want to make sure that it is just over 1/8 of an inch in from this rounded edge. So after we get done basting, we're going to cut some notches. And we're going to use our basting line as the reference point in which to snip the notches no deeper than 1/8 of an inch. And so it can be very helpful. Granted, there's going to be so many of you that are going to comment and get mad at me because you snipped into your basting stitches. But myself and other testers have agreed that yes, it is frustrating if you do snip into your basting stitch, but it's also a really helpful guide. So it is important to do that. And one other final note is that we're going to be removing this thread later, this basting line. And so if you have a material that really shows needle holes poorly and your basting line was maybe a little bit further than 1/8 of an inch or just over 1/8 of an inch in or something like that, and so when you remove it later you may see those needle holes, you can potentially, if you want to, leave your basting, your gathering stitch in. But I would suggest, and as do other testers suggest, having a thread color for this basting step that matches the exterior material so it's not as noticeable. That's up to you. I haven't had an issue with my needle holes showing, but it's me, and so I don't use myself as a reference point for things like that when I come to offering recommendations to you, because I know that I'm very, very, very meticulous. So anyway, I'm going to stop blathering and I'll go do that basting stitch and I'll show you what it looks like. So I just finished basting this edge, and you can see I started and stopped right before those notches. I went all the way around the outer edge. It is just over 1/8 of an inch, and you can see that although my tension looked fine from the other side, it's very loose on this side, and that's ideal. I did sew with my stabilizer face up, so that would be my bobbin thread. And I also clipped my threads just kind of out of the way so that when I snip my notches in this next step, I don't have to worry about continuously maneuvering them around. So my notches need to go all the way around this basted edge, and we obviously don't want to snip into our basting stitch, and we want to snip little tiny notches up between 1/4 inch and 3/8 of an inch apart. And so that's actually a little closer together than I want it to be, so I'm gonna maybe do 1.5 of every stitch. And so this might not seem like enough to actually gather that edge later on properly. I promise you this is actually a little too tight of a distance here, which is like closer to every snip being about just over 1/8 of an inch apart from each other in this flat section. You really are going for the flat section to be around 3/8 of an inch between each notch. So there are my notched edges. And so I wanted to address a question that came up in testing that I think other people will ask as well, which is, can we cut the notches before we sew the basting line, or the gathering basting stitch line? And the answer is yes, you can do that. I experienced a couple things I wasn't too happy about when I did that, and so that's why I wrote it this way. But the one issue is that there is a chance that when you're sewing this line, or this basting line after you've cut your notches, your stitch may fall inside of the gap there of that notch, and then with your tension so loose and things going on, there's a chance that your thread may tangle slightly on itself, and if that happens, then that's going to impact your ability to gather. It also may mean that it's not really hitting the right spots and like actually gathering the material itself. And so it might be one little spot where there's a bit of a bump because it just kind of didn't go where it should have gone, especially if it went in the gap between the two notches, right in the middle of the center of that notch. And also there are times where you will cut your notch too far. So it's unavoidable to sew in that if you're trying to stay within the seam allowance as called for the basting line. And if you cut your notch too deep, it's going to show in your finished pouch. So this kind of is the more meticulous, of course, option to do, but it is, I think it prevents some of the things that we don't want later on, and it makes gathering easier. So hopefully I can show you the gathering effectively on camera. It's a little hard to show from the top down, but we'll try our best. So I'm going to only be focusing on the thread tail that is on the right side of this material. So these two thread tails are on the wrong side, and I need to pull the one that's on the right side. So that would be this one and this one. So I'm just going to start pulling on them ever so much. And I'm going to I like to hold my material down on my table like this, and then I just start pulling. And that's going to pull it very taut against your stabilizer, and you can always just kind of unbow it, bows a little bit. And then as you continue to tug, you'll see that all those little notches you cut like to rest very nicely. And I'm going to continue to pull from both sides. If you find that your tension wasn't really loose enough and you're not really gathering this top section here, then you can always do what I do, which is I grab my little tiny screwdriver. I don't want to use anything that's too sharp or it could potentially break my thread, and pull it nice and taut here to kind of release the tension, and then I'll pull again on these sides down here, and that'll continue to gather down here. Now, as you can see, these areas down here don't gather as nicely, but that's okay. We are going to do that just by continuing to pull it tightly, and then we're just going to tie them together. So you see mine's a little bowed there. Once I kind of pull it a little bit more taut, it sits as it needs to. And these two edges down here are going to lift up ever so slightly because it's just not part of that really nice circle there where everything is naturally pulling against each other. But that's not a big deal. We're going to glue and clip everything nice and flat. So now I am just going to add a little bit of glue in that little bit of ditch that we have to work with. And this glue's coming out quite a bit. I don't really see a problem of using a good amount of glue here, unless maybe you're using woven material and you're afraid it's going to really seep out a bunch. But I really like that nice hold here, so I don't really hold back with glue all that much. My favorite is this one, which is Beacon 3-in-1. It's a tacky glue. I actually prefer it when it gets to be a little older because then it gets even more tacky. That's my preference. But don't use something that's too liquidy of a glue because then it's really not going to, it's going to run all over the place and probably not give you the results you want. I'm going to just clip all the way around this edge. I know it's hard to see from the right side, but there are no puckers to be seen. It really is a nice process. I'm going to do the same on the other. If your glue got away from you a little bit like mine did, it's not a big deal. You can either take it off like I am. I'm using this little like rubber kind of, I don't even know what you would call this thing, but anyway, whatever this is, I'm using this to kind of squeege it off because it's just a silicone tip, so the glue will come off real easily. Or you could just rub it further onto your stabilizer like I'm doing right now. Either way, you could squidge it out like this, or you could just remove it entirely. You know, now's probably a good time to wash your hands and get all that wonderful glue off your fingers. It really is the worst. So now that I'm letting that glue dry on the other seam allowance, I'm going to apply 1/8 inch double-sided tape in these straight sections right here. I'm going to apply it right along that edge. And I'm using 1/8 inch double-sided tape from Wawak. I think it is probably the strongest double-sided tape that I have experienced. It really holds things rather well, but at the same time it's not really domestic friendly. So just keep that in mind with whatever double-sided tape you're using, or if you purchase this one. So now, once we get that adhered, we're going to remove this double-sided tape backing, and we're going to fold this in as far as we can right up against that stabilizer edge, just like we did for the rest of that seam allowance. We really want to fold it as tightly against that stabilizer as we can. I'm going to do that for both sides. And if you noticed, I kind of just pulled my thread tails out of the way for that process so that I don't adhere those thread tails to that double-sided tape, so that when I remove it later, I don't have to contend with that. So now you see on each edge here, you have these little spots that are poking up. Those are those notches that we made right at the very beginning. And so now what you're going to do is you're going to put some glue in those little spots, and you're going to fold everything down and clip it to secure. It's really hard to show on camera because I need to use my fingers in such a tiny little spot, but I will show you once it dries what that corner should be looking like. But essentially, you're just kind of easing it as best as you can to create as seamless of an edge as possible there. And again, I know it's a little bit of a headache, but I'm trying to maneuver around my basting thread as much as I can, just to make life easier for me once this glue dries. So in the pattern, I tell you that if you have got to this point and once all this glue dries, if you're using a woven material, then I want you to apply another layer of glue on top of this already fused and adhered seam allowance, so that you have a nice kind of edge that will stick better to double-sided tape. Woven itself, same material I'm using for my lining here, and this is the example that I used in the pattern, but woven itself tends to, like, when it comes out of, when it's printed and everything, it's just not, it doesn't adhere really well to a lot of double-sided tape that we use. And so I have you kind of just apply this glue, and so you'll see it in the reflections of my lights, where I just applied a layer of glue around the outer edge, and then I just kind of used this tool to kind of spread it around, so that now I have almost what feels like a plastic edge, and double-sided tape will just stick so much better to that than it will this woven material by itself. So just keep that in mind. I don't suggest skipping that step. So now you want to let your glue set for a while. I would say probably a minimum of 20 minutes. You don't really want to take off that basting thread any earlier than you need to, because it's doing such a good job of keeping everything nice and set. So just to kind of jump ahead slightly to give you an idea of what to expect later on, we are going to be sewing along this outer, or along these main panels, either on your Biscuit or your Royal Companion. And when we sew on the zipper, we're going to be sewing 1/8 of an inch away from the folded edge here. So this outer edge of your material. So if you look and see your basting stitch line is probably not fully 1/8 of an inch away from the folded edge. And so I always remove my basting thread, but if you think that your material is not going to handle that well and it's going to show those needle holes, then I would suggest that you use a thread that matches your exterior color like I mentioned earlier. And now you can kind of see why. Some testers had that, some didn't. Unfortunately, it's kind of like pick your poison in this situation. It is a tiny pouch. I think it's kind of acceptable given the project and how good it all turns out and how convenient the gathering is. So if it really bugs you, again, use a thread color that matches your exterior. So I'm going to continue to let this glue sit. And so if you're making the Royal Companion, you can skip forward to the Royal Companion assembly that is linked in the description below. I think I said earlier that I was going to do glue for both options, the Biscuit and the Royal Companion, but I think I'm going to do double-sided tape for this one just so I can make sure that you see that. So the first step in the Biscuit main panel prep is going to be that you, in between these two markings that you made on the wrong side of your full main panel, you are going to follow these curves and snip into your seam allowance so that your snips are no more than 1/8 of an inch away from their stabilizer edge and about 1/8 of an inch apart from each other. So I'll do that and I'll show you what it looks like. And so you can see that they're about 1/8 of an inch away. It's really hard to show you unless I do this. Okay, so you want to do that for both sides of that curve. So since I'm going to use double-sided tape to adhere my gathering, what I'll do now is apply 1/8 inch double-sided tape all around the edge of this stabilizer, okay? I'm really going to follow this edge here, and I'm just going to press as I go so that it kind of conforms to that shape. So you can see I've gotten all that double-sided tape adhered, but now I really want to seam roll it using my little seam roller here. And that's really just going to further push down all those little gaps that showed up, or that kind of poked up. And it's going to make sure that I get a really nice adhesion to my Decaville light. If you happened to reverse your stabilizer fusings, right? So let's say this is technically Profuse Stiff from Wawak. Let's say I fused that first and then I put my Decaville Heavy on top. I will say that I've found that Decaville Heavy does not accept glue and double-sided tape nearly as well as this material here. I don't really use Decaville Light all that much now. Profuse Stiff is a perfect replacement that I have found for it, actually even better. But I know that when I say Decaville Light, you all know what I mean. So I do it this way, but you'll have to see if you have any issues with double-sided tape on your Decaville Heavy or your Decaville Light. But worst case scenario, just use glue. So now that we have that double-sided tape on there, we're going to baste around these edges, starting at these lines here. So this whole rounded edge, you're going to baste on both sides. You're going to baste using just over 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. And there's a couple things you got to keep in mind while you're basting here. One is that you need to make sure that you are using the loosest tension possible. So the whole point of this basting stitch is to pull those threads so that we are going to gather notches that we're going to make later on. And so if your tension is too tight, it's going to be really hard to break it. So if you're starting out with a looser tension, it's going to be that much easier for you to gather your stitches later. Also, you need to make sure that your stitch length is as long as possible. I know that on domestic machines, mine has a limit of a stitch length of 5. And on my industrial, I have a stitch length of 7. And so I'm going to use a 7. And that means that there's just going to be a lot less stitches around this curve. The less stitches there are, the easier it's going to be to pull. It was brought to my attention during testing that that is not something that everyone does when they baste, is loosen their tension or lengthen their stitch length. For this process, both of them are pretty necessary. And the last thing is that if you are worried about stitch holes showing on your material, a couple testers brought it up. You may want to use a thread color for just this step. You can use contrasting thread or whatever thread you want for any other seam, but for gathering in particular, you may want to use thread that matches your exterior color. That way, if you don't want to remove your basting stitch, then you can just leave it in and it will be pretty invisible, but that is something I'll explain further once we get through the gathering and then into the zipper installation. So I'm sorry for that long-winded explanation of all the things to keep in mind while basting and gathering, but it really is important and it really makes the process that much more seamless. So I'll do that basting now, again just over 1/8 of an inch. That's pretty important, and I'll show you why after I get that done. So now I've got my basting done. I kept it just over 1/8 of an inch, I mean just a hair over. Just essentially the width of the thread over my 1/8 inch marking. And so I started and stopped at each line that I drew, and I left long thread tails, and I just clipped them to the wrong side or to the other side so that I can work without having them kind of all hanging everywhere. And so now what I'm going to do is all around this basted edge, I'm going to snip little notches, and I want to make sure that in between those notches there's a gap of between 1/4 inch and 3/8 of an inch. And I don't want to cut into my basting thread at all, because if I do, I'll have to restitch this line because it will no longer serve the purpose that we need. And so I'm going to do that all around these two edges. So there's my first edge. Now I'm going to do my other side. So I've got all my notches snipped. You'll see they're not perfect. Some of them are closer together than others. Some of them are wider than others. So now it's going to be the fun part, which is the gathering. I feel like I remember somebody call this magic the gathering somehow, and I find that to be very funny. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on pulling the thread that is on the right side of my material. Now I didn't specify if that's your bobbin thread or your top thread, because it really just depends on the orientation in which you sewed your basting stitch line. Regardless, the thread that is on the right side is the one that we want to be pulling here. And so I'm going to ignore these two that are on the wrong side of my material, and I'm just going to pull them. And so I'm just going to keep pulling it as much as I can. I don't want to distort my panel too much, but it's something that we can undo just by loosening the tension in just a little bit. But as you can see, when we pull on those threads together, everything gets nicely nestled here. There's no buckling to be seen from the right side at all. It follows the edge of that stabilizer nicely. There's no puckers on the wrong side here. Everything is very nicely gathered. And so you can see as it goes down closer to the center, you know, this is gathering so nicely because it's round and it has a lot of tension. Down here, the tension is loose. It's very loose right here. And so it's not pulling in as much. And so I like to kind of tug back and forth a couple times to try and get this as tight as I can down here on each side. All right, and so now I'm going to tie them together. It's going to be a temporary knot because I do want to remove my basting stitches later, but I still need to hold everything flat here and there. So I'm going to tie this knot, and if you tie it pretty tight, because it's kind of hard to tie a super tight knot up against this, if you tie it a little bit extra tight, then you can kind of work it back to be nice and flat. It's bowing a little bit. That's not going to be a major impact to anything. And once we remove that basting stitch, all that tension is going to break as it is. And so now we have what feels like a little bit of an effortless gathering on such a round edge. You can see how nice it looks there. And so now I'm going to repeat that gathering process on this side as well. And then you see how it's bowing a little bit? Just going to kind of take that extra tight tension and allow it to kind of expand throughout the entire edge. I'm gonna trim these thread tails just so that they get out of my way, because we will have some double-sided tape exposed here in a minute. All right, and so now we're going to remove this double-sided tape backing. You're gonna have to work around your thread tails here. And then you are going to pinch these sides first. I got a little ahead of myself there. Pinch all these sides down. They should be nicely gathered and nicely snug against the edge of your stabilizer. Seam roll. And then, as you probably guessed, we're going to fold in these snipped edges like this. I'm going to do that again on the other side. And even though I'm using really good tape, I do like to clip in some of these sections just to make sure everything is nice and secure. So there's a couple more steps left for the biscuit prep, which is to do a bit of a kind of false stitch line. Although it isn't really necessarily a false stitch line, as it does serve a purpose. It is going to secure these snipped edges, and it's going to give us a reference line to sew on the lining towards the end. So it doesn't really seem like it's doing much now, but believe me, it's important, and do not skip it. So what I've done is I've repositioned my clips now to be right in line with these two lines here, so that when I flip it over, I can now make little marks using removable ink, and I know that it's in line with what I've already drawn, knowing that I have my center marking, which I've used to make sure everything is nice and straight and all that stuff. I have just transferred those markings to the right side. If you don't want to use clips, or you think that this is a little too finicky for you, you can always use your ruler and trace it to the edge, and then just kind of follow it around. You could put pins in there and then use those, trace right where that pin is right there. Totally up to you, but this is a good option too. And so once that is done, I'm going to remove these clips because I'm going to be sewing over them, and I've got good double-sided tape. And now I'm going to I'm going to connect these two lines so that I have a good line to follow. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start it doesn't matter which side you start on, but you want to start in the center of those drawn lines, leave long thread tails, stitch all the way down, pivot, follow this curved edge using an 1/8 inch seam allowance, pivot again, go all the way across, all the way back down, pivot again, and then meet the starting stitch line there in the center of that drawn line. Leave long thread tails, and then pull it to the back, and then knot it and secure your knot. And so I'll do all that, and I'll show you once I'm done. Also, don't forget to increase your tension back to your normal tension that you would need for something like this, and then also reduce your stitch length. So I just pulled my work from my machine, and you can see I did exactly as instructed. And before I finished stitching, I did pull my starting thread tail to the wrong side. But what I like to do is, sometimes I'll even pull this one out, is that I won't try to stitch in my exact needle hole that I started in if I know that it's going to be a little bit hard to do. Like I have to bring my stitch in a little bit shorter or a little bit further. I just won't even try to. And so I will then pull the top thread back out, leave the ending thread, these are the top threads, leave them out, and then I'll find the happy medium in between those two stitches, and I will just insert my hand needle and then kind of poke it through. My nail is my favorite thimble. Then I'll feed my thread tails through my hand sewing needle, just like that. Then when I pull it through, we'll at least have 2 smaller stitches, but not one very short stitch and one very long stitch. Sometimes it happens. Sometimes it's just pretty much unavoidable because you need to pivot. But I think that it's all within the realm of acceptable, you know, existence. So now we're going to tie a knot on the wrong side. Make sure that as you are doing any manipulating of those thread tails, that you don't mess up your tension down there. You still want it to look nice and proper. So just be mindful of that when you tighten your knot. And then I like to put a little bit of glue on that knot to better secure it. I'm going to clip these to the side while that dries. So in the pattern, I tell you that if you have got to this point and once all this glue dries, if you're using a woven material, then I want you to apply another layer of glue on top of this already fused and adhered seam allowance so that you have a nice kind of edge that will stick better to double-sided tape. Woven itself, same material I'm using for my lining here, and this is the example that I used in the pattern, but woven itself tends to, like, when it comes out of, when it's printed and everything, it's just not, it doesn't adhere really well to a lot of double-sided tape that we use. And so I have you kind of just apply this glue, and so you'll see it in the reflections of my lights, where I just applied a layer of glue around the outer edge, and then I just kind of used this tool to kind of spread it around so that now I have almost what feels like a plastic edge, and double-sided tape will just stick so much better to that than it will this woven material by itself. So just keep that in mind. I don't suggest skipping that step. And now you can skip ahead to the zipper installation. For the Royal Companion, if you are coming here right after clicking that link down below from the main panel prep, then your glue may not be dry yet. If it's not dry yet, then just let it sit for a bit and then come back to this. Maybe skip ahead to the lining if you are concerned about your glue still being a little tacky. I did remove my clips because I just got done doing the whole biscuit part, so my glue is now nice and dry. So you'll need both of your main panels that have been prepped. You'll need your spine, your connector, and your hardware. Now, if you're using a snap hook or a D-ring that can't be removed and placed on at the end, you will need to install that during this process. If not, and you're using a gate ring like me, you can put this aside until the very end. And so if you've ever made the rosy, this piece right here is going to feel very familiar. What you're going to do is you're going to snip into these curved edges here. You want those snips to be no deeper than 1/4 inch, and you want them to be around 1/4 inch apart. So I'll do that. There are our snips, you can see. So now on the wrong side of this, we're going to apply 1/8 inch double-sided tape along those curved lines we drew, okay, along each side. So now that I have done that, I'm going to remove those 2 double-sided tape backings, and I'm going to fold them in to meet that drawn line. I know it's a little hard to see on camera because I had to use my silver marking pen, but essentially you're just kind of fully manipulating this little piece so that it follows and it mimics that drawn line. And when you do that, it's going to want to bow. That's expected, and that's kind of what we're going for. So I'll show you a little better here. So I'm going to snip this excess on each end. And so now you're going to top stitch along each curved edge using an 1/8 inch seam allowance. I like to back stitch just 1 to 2 stitches on each end just so that it's nice and secure. So I'll do that now. So I just got done stitching those sides. You can see it's 1/8 of an inch away from each folded edge. So I can set this aside for now, and we're going to focus on the spine for a little bit. So very similar to how you snipped in the corners of the main panels, you're going to kind of angle your scissors so that you snip a notch that kind of points to the point of the stabilizer piece, just like that. Again, you always want to make sure that you're not snipping any closer than 1/8 of an inch away from these pieces, from the stabilizers, or else it will probably show. So that's what we should be working with. Oh, I forgot to do some lines here. So if you're like me and you forgot to do a line, you should probably do that in the prep section. So now you're going to make small snips into both curved sections on the shorter sides of your spine. You want them to be no more than 1/8 of an inch away from the stabilizer edge, and you want them to be about 1/8 of an inch apart. This is what we're going for here. And now we're going to apply some double-sided tape right on this line here. And we're going to go from edge to edge here, just like this. So then we're going to remove the double-sided tape backing. We're just going to fold in these edges to meet. I'm going to fold these outer edges first because I want them to be in line with that straight edge. See if I can get a little closer. And then fold up the rest to kind of match. Okay, again, I'm folding against that stabilizer to mimic that edge, just like that. Same for the other side. That is what we are going for. Now, just like on the connector, we're going to top stitch along each side using an 1/8 inch seam allowance and making sure to backstitch nice and neatly. So we just got done top stitching those edges. And now you want to grab your connector and you want to align it with the center marking of the spine. So I'm going to trim this down a little bit because it's bothering me. So I like to just look at it from the wrong side. You'll see the center marking lines up rather nicely. I'm going to clip. And then I'm going to baste along this edge here using 1/8 inch seam allowance. You don't have to do what you did for the gathering. You can leave it at your normal stitch length. You can leave it at your normal tension. Just baste along that edge to secure it. So you can see I've basted it, and if you can see, your bulk for that should align so that the corners of your connector are not overlapping with the seam allowance of your spine. Hopefully, if everything went well, that's how it should be. So now if you're using something like a D-ring, you would want to put that on now. I like to fold it in half. And then you would align this edge here, again, referencing your center markings and making sure that your edge is nice and straight. You'd clip. And you would baste on this edge here. It's going to be loose now, but when we complete the whole construction, you'll see it will be nice and flush. You have to account for that pulling of materials, and so you need the extra now. Although it doesn't feel necessary, it will later on. But if you're not using a D-ring that doesn't have that clip in there, then you can just baste this as it is. So now we have this spine contraption here and our two main panels, and we need to put them all together. And so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to apply some 1/4 inch double-sided tape right along this 3/8 inch line that we drew. Again, I know that your basting threads are probably in the way. You can snip them now to get them out of the way, which is what I'm going to do because my glue is nice and set. I don't really have to worry about it. And I do want them out of the way. And as a matter of fact, there are plenty of points in this whole construction where you can pull out your basting thread. I'm going to do this right now, and I like to do it with a set of pliers. So I'm going to get my pliers. So I just reach in under some of my threads, and I'll start pulling. And then if I can get a good hold of one, make sure I'll snip my knot off. And then I'll just kind of keep pulling, and most of the time your tension is loose enough to pull it right out. And these does take a little bit more finesse, but it can take some time. Oh, so I broke my thread or my glue on that one. That's fine. I mean, it's not fine, but I probably just didn't apply enough glue there, so it's not the end of the world if this happens to you. A little bit more glue. As much as I want to be, I'm not perfect. But all the other ones stayed, as you can see, so that was probably just a spot where I didn't apply enough glue to kind of last through that. So I'm going to see what the other side looks like. This is the one where I definitely overglued, so we'll see. That's more of what I'm going for, so I don't have to worry about any of that thread showing. And the glue definitely got to be a little messy, but it'll be fine. It'll buff out, as my husband likes to say. So when it comes to my zipper installation, this one with the clips on it is going to be the one that I'm going to sew second, just so that I give my glue just a little bit more time to dry. I do have some gunky spots, but the thing about tacky glue is it can be fairly easy to remove because it tends to clump up, which is good in some ways and bad in others. But for me, in this experience, it's rather easy to pick it off. Okay, so that's gonna remain clipped while we work on this main panel assembly. And until then, we're going to apply some 1/4 inch double-sided tape to each 3/8 inch line here. And the reason for 1/4 inch double-sided tape for this particular seam is that it really does offer a much stronger hold than 1/8 inch can offer you. And we really don't want a lot of budging with this, because it will, if you just use 1/8 inch double-sided tape, the way in which we sew the seam, it could cause this seam to be wider, and we don't want that. And so using 1/4 inch double-sided tape creates a stronger hold, and we don't really have to worry about it budging at all. It's too strong, too much adhesion there, and it keeps everything right where we want it. So now we've put that 1/4 inch double-sided tape. I'm going to remove that backing, and I'm going to align that center mark that I have on my spine with the center mark on a main panel, just like that. And I'm going to do the same on this side. We want that to be a nice straight line, and an easy way to reference that is to grab a ruler and just see how everything aligns. So that's pretty straight for me. And now what we're going to do is we're going to top stitch along each adhered edge using an 1/8 inch seam allowance. Now the point in which you want to start and stop is going to be right where this top stitching on the spine started and stopped. So right here, right here, right here, and right here. And you can definitely make those reference marks for yourself. It just makes life a little easier. And you want to leave long thread tails and start from one marking, top stitch along the other side, and then stop and leave long tails. And do this for each side here. Alright, so each main panel was top stitched, and before I go through and knot everything and all that, I'm going to double check that that placement that I saw before, that straight line, has maintained itself through my top stitching, because sometimes we know that shifting happens. So there's my line, and I'd say it's still pretty darn straight, so we're going to keep it as is. And so now you will pull all those thread tails to the wrong side. And so now I'm going to knot each individual pair of threads. So 1, 2, 3, 4. And then I'm going to pull them to the center line and knot them there. And then I'll show you how we're going to bury and secure that knot so we don't have to worry about it coming out. So no more thread tails on the right side, and on the wrong side we have 4 knots. So now I'm going to knot them each half together. So now I have 2 knots. So I'm going to trim this all to be one length just so it's easier to feed through my needle. And before I even insert them through my needle, I'm just going to put my needle where I want it and then feed the threads through the eye hole. So I'm going to insert my needle in between these 2 stitch lines here. And my goal is to have it come out right between the 2 of those layers of material. So let me get that going and then I'll show you, because I think it's a little too hard to show you while I'm doing it. There we go. So if you can see here, here's one layer and then my needle is right between those 2 layers. And so I'm going to insert it about halfway through, and then I'm going to put all my thread tails through this needle hole. Then I'm going to pull it through. It's going to need a little bit of a yank. Sometimes if your knot is small enough, it comes through real easily like that. That's not always the case. But what that did is that just buried that knot in between those 2 layers. And then I want to put a little dab of glue on each knot. So I want to put a little dab of glue right here, and right here. And if you wanted to, for good measure, you could always put a little bit of glue in between those 2 layers. That keeps everything nice and secure. And now you can trim your thread tails. So I'm going to show you again. Right between those 2 stitch lines and right on the center marking, I'm going to angle my needle to come out right between those 2 layers. And then I'm going to insert my thread tails and pull it all the way through, then place the glue on those 3 knots. And now we can move on to the zipper installation. For the zipper installation, you will need whichever version you're making and your length of zipper tape. We do not need the zipper pull for this process because that gets inserted at the very end. Now, you could have removed your basting line like I did from my Royal Companion, or you can leave it in like I did on the Biscuit. It is really up to you, and when you want to remove that basting stitch line, if I would have left mine on my Royal Companion and taken it out after I had sewn on my zipper, I wouldn't have to worry about any of the lifting up like I did in the one spot that I had to re-glue. So that's something to keep in mind. But of course, it may be a little bit harder to remove because there's a chance you're going to sew over some of the basting stitches. It really is just kind of which headache you want to deal with. But it really, even though it's a bit of a pain to remove the stitches, it really does make life so much easier using that gathering method. So the zipper installation is going to be mostly the same for both options, with a couple very minor changes that I will show you when that time happens. So please bear with me through the rest of this tutorial because I am doing things simultaneously and going to have to show you back and forth. So for the Royal Companion, you do need to make some additional lines. Now this kind of seems like it's not really necessary, but it does help you align your zipper properly at the center area, which is a little harder to see because we have so much stuff going on. So what you're going to do is you're going to just see how this seam allowance you would imagine it would curve over here to this, this is our knot for this seam. So what you want to do is you want to trace this seam allowance down to that knot, and just that way you kind of see that edge, and that edge right there is going to be your guide for applying your zipper tape. So I'm going to do that on each little corner here. Again, it's just from that seam allowance right there to the knot of that stitch line. I know that seems a little silly, but I promise it will make a little bit more sense once we put the zipper on. So you can absolutely use glue for this step. I do prefer to use a double-sided tape here, especially the one from Wawak. It just makes it a little bit easier to manage. Glue is definitely still a good option. Again, it's really important to use tacky glue here, because if you're using glue that is too fluid, it's going to seep all over the place. So that is totally up to you, but I'm going to use double-sided tape for my zipper installation. I've done it both ways. Both ways work. It's just one you have to be a little bit more careful of. And for the sake of time, double-sided tape is best for me in this process. So starting at our previous stitch lines, I'm going to start applying double-sided tape along that, and then follow the edge of the seam allowance of the material. Okay, I'm going to zoom in for you. Okay, and then I'm going to seam roll this to make sure it stays. And then I'm going to do the same on the other side. So I've got both sides done on my Royal Companion, and now I'm going to do the same on my Biscuit. And I'm just going to go from the pivot point where we stopped stitching on the right side. I'm going to apply that double-sided tape all the way around. Now, because I'm using double-sided tape, I'm going to go through and just kind of make sure that no gap has been formed between the edge of my stabilizer and that inner fold of my exterior, which can happen sometimes. And I don't want that. And so now I'm just kind of re-pinching and re-adhering as I go around the edge. So for each option, you're going to work on one half at a time. So the first thing you're going to do is melt the edges of your zipper tape to make sure that we're not dealing with a majorly frayed edge. And then we're going to separate them. Now, if you're doing two at one time like me, don't separate them both. In case there's anything off between your center markings or whatever, just work on one at a time and use the same two halves at the same time. So I'm going to start with the Royal Companion. And so I'm going to remove my double-sided tape backing from one side. Then I am going to flip my tape so that I'm looking at the wrong side, and I'm going to align my center marking with the center marking on the wrong side of my main panel, and I'm going to align the edge of my zipper with the edge of this seam allowance. And I'm going to continue to follow that all the way around. And the way that I've found to get the nicest edge is to just kind of pinch it. Okay, you want to curve that front around at the same time. So kind of holding it like this, and I'm kind of pinching it like this. And then I'm just easing it around as I go and pressing it into that double-sided tape. And then as you get closer to this center area, again, follow that line you drew, follow the edge of your double-sided tape, and just clip it. I like to just angle my zipper coil right at the opposing center line, and then go back and pinch it again just to make sure it's all nice and happily adhered. When you do one side at a time like I just did, which is a bad habit for me for this pouch, you can see that in that process I kind of made my zipper not as centered. So don't do that, okay? I'm going to try and manipulate it back, but it's not that big of a deal because we can kind of offset it coil by coil. So mine ended up being about 1/8 of an inch off there, which is why I tell you to, and I should listen to my own advice, to do it from the center, work your way down, and then once you hit about halfway, then you can work single side at a time. But you'll see when we install the zipper pull why we can work with that still. And you can see how my zipper tape is off there. They're not meeting up perfectly, and that is a mimic of that offset down there, which is fine. I promise it's fine. You know me, I wouldn't tell you if it wasn't fine. So now I'm going to go back through, and I'm just going to pinch down as many of these little puckers that I may see existing as possible, so that I can make sure that when I sew everything on, it'll be nice and smooth. And now, if you are concerned about your tape lifting, which is a concern because there's a lot of pressure going on, you see how much that zipper tape is pulling down, then I would suggest you clip. I'm going to clip, even though, as we know, I've got great tape. Still going to clip. So I'm taking that rounded portion of my clip and allowing it to go over my tape, and the flat portion is on the back of my tape. That line that I drew on my zipper tape, I'll take these off to show you. I want to make sure that that stays as consistent as possible throughout. So for me, it's mostly sitting on just on the inside of that curve of the exterior for me. Or yes, of the exterior. And so I just want to make sure that there's not one part where it majorly dips down into my seam allowance or above it or anything like that. I'm trying to keep it as consistent as possible, and that's what that reference line is for. But you can see it's also going to be mostly covered up by the lining. So I wouldn't stress about it too much, but if you are using a bright white zipper tape and red pen, I would say maybe not a good idea to have that marking on there, although it is quote-unquote removable. Okay, so this is one side and of the Royal Companion. Now I'm going to do that exact same thing on one side of the Biscuit. So again, wrong side up, I have my center marking on my tape that I'm going to align with that center marking on the stabilizer. And this time I'm going to work equally from that center point out so that I don't make my tape shift. It could still shift depending on your tape, but this at least puts your best foot forward. So now that I've adhered a good chunk of that space, I can keep going and continue to adhere. So now that you have your zipper tape applied and you're happy with your application, then we're going to top stitch it in place. Again, we're going to use an 1/8 inch seam allowance, using the edge of our exterior as the guide, or as the edge that we're measuring 1/8 of an inch from. And so for the Royal Companion, you're going to put your first needle hole here in one of these stitches from this stitch line where you attach the spine. Over here for the Biscuit, you're going to start right at that pivot point. You're going to insert your needle in that hole, go all the way around, and then do the same thing on the other side. And you're stitching in that pivot point. As you sew, obviously you're going to be removing your clips, but the thing you really need to keep in mind is that because it's a small round object, you have a lot of pivoting to do. So make sure you're pivoting very frequently. If you're sewing straight for 2 stitches and your stitch length is a 5 or a 5.5, you're not following the edge of this circle. I like to sew my donuts with a stitch length of a 4.5. I find that to be a good stitch length to do proper pivoting without messing anything up, or not to best accurately follow the edge is what I'm trying to say. But also the other thing you need to keep in mind is that because your zipper tape will want to naturally pull in like this, as you're sewing, you need to be pushing it out of the way ever so slightly. And that's where that strong double-sided tape comes in, right? There's so much tension because this creates the proper kind of nice zipper tape application that we want. You require all this tension. I've tried it other ways and you just get a wavy, kind of ugly zipper that doesn't look as nice as what this one gives you. So it is important for you to make sure that you have that nice double-sided tape, but again, it causes you to have to kind of push it out some as you sew. In addition to that, right? So far to recap, you need to make sure that you're pivoting frequently and you need to push the zipper tape out of the way as you sew. You should also be sewing with something that is a narrow zipper foot, something where the needle is close to the edge of the presser foot, okay? So that's going to be a zipper foot or a skinny or narrow foot. I pretty much exclusively sew with a skinny foot on my industrial, but if I was sewing this on my domestic, I would use my zipper foot. That would get me closer to the edge because a wider foot right? So the edge of the foot that's too wide is going to really push this zipper tape out, and that combination of pressure and everything is going to make it hard to get a really nice top stitch. So skinny foot, pivot often, and keep your zipper tape out of the way. One more note is that one, you should start and stop with long thread tails. I did not mention that because you will need to knot everything to the wrong side. But also, if you want, you are welcome to sew a little bit closer, a little bit less than 1/8 of an inch away from that edge. That's going to help you avoid any double-sided tape peeking through after construction. And depending on your double-sided tape, you might be able to remove it, but we are going to be sewing through it pretty much. So that's something to keep in mind, is that there is a chance, depending on your seam allowance, depending on how accurately your stabilizer was placed, the thickness of your materials, how well you placed your double-sided tape, how accurate your seam allowance is for this, that a sliver of that double-sided tape will show in your finished pouch. And so if that's a concern for you, I recommend maybe removing the double-sided tape and using glue if that's like a big deal breaker for you. Or reapplying it and having it further in. So I just wanted to say that. I know this is long, I'm sorry, but it is important as well. So you see how I started parallel, or I continued on that line and then I pivoted. And then you see how it wants to pull in against that zipper tape, or against that edge. And that's where the challenge is. It's going to be pulling the most right here, and then it'll loosen as I get closer. So right now I'm just really making sure that my zipper tape stays outside of my foot. Now I'm going to hand crank into this last spot where I am trying to be aligned with that stitch line, trying to maneuver around my little tripod. And then I'm going to do my best to insert it into that needle hole. And we'll see how I did. Not too bad. And I'm gonna flip it around. It looks like I definitely went over 1/8 of an inch over here, which means that my tape is probably going to be peeking through. That is not necessarily ideal for me. It's not even my tape that's showing. That is just a little bit too off for me. We'll see how I feel. It'll be lunchtime for me in a little bit, so I will see if I'm gonna fix that or not. Actually I might, and I'll show you how I piece it together. I don't know. I don't know about this one. We'll see. Maybe I should just leave it. I will leave it. I'm gonna leave it. And again, it is the same process here for the biscuit. We're just starting in that little pivot point right there. So I'm putting my needle in that hole, and then I'm gonna do my best to stitch all the way around and not allow the tripod to mess me up. Okay, that's the goal. Do you see how when I'm pivoting, I'm not lifting my foot up? I'm only pivoting very slightly, and I am leaving my foot down during that process and my needle in my work. And that is going to make sure that when I lift up, or when I pivot, I don't have the zipper tape fold under my foot, which is going to cause it, as you stitch forward, it'll jump off and then your stitch will be really crazy. You don't want that. Let's scooch it out so we can see. So I will take that. That is a nice seam allowance right there. Sorry, it's not too well lit over here at the machine for this video, but I'll take that. And so I'm going to do both of the other sides just like I just did those first two sides for each version, and then we'll check back in. And no, I'm not going to redo the stitching on the Royal Companion. I'll just leave it be and survive and hate it forever. see I did clip away that excess zipper tape and the thread tails. In the pattern I have you do one side, not at all, and then you come over here, but for sake of time and simplicity for me, I am going to do that all at once. Yeah, that's not too bad. I'll take it. And time for the Royal Companion. And we'll see how I did. Definitely better, I think. Maybe a little bit not perfect there, but I'll take what I can get. All right, fresh off the sewing machine, I'm gonna take all my clips off. And we'll take a look at my seam allowance, both on the right side and the wrong side. And I'll show you when it matters and when it doesn't matter, and all that good stuff. So please just ignore all the thread tails for now. I know they're kind of in the way, but as you can see, the stitch line here from your pivot points and down it looks really nice there and really seamless as long as you're consistent with your seam allowances. And the same goes for the Royal Companion and those two little edges right there. So this is the side where I didn't do as good of a job top stitching. I got to be a little bit more than 1/8 of an inch there. I tend to like to be just under it, that way I just feel a little bit better about it. This one was closer to what I'm going for, but still not perfect, but that's okay. I give myself some grace when I'm on camera because I'm on camera. And so that's from the outside, but obviously we're concerned about what it's going to be like on the inside. So in the pattern, I tell you that like the wonkiness of this top stitching, as long as you're sticking within 1/8 of an inch, you shouldn't have too much to worry about because we adhered it and kind of fused it, per se, with the double-sided tape. We put the placement on there, we kept the placement, and then the stitching is just securing that placement where it was, right? And we're going to be doing some other things, but it's not going to have a ton of pressure on this zipper. I mean, this is a tiny little 4-inch pouch, okay? We just need it to be installed, and the stitches that we're doing is doing that, and it's not like it's something that's going to be ripped constantly or anything like that. This is perfect for this sort of use. And so on the wrong side, as long as we caught our zipper tape, the major differences we may see here and there are not going to impact the functionality. I could have increased my tension now that I see that. It will be fine, but I definitely could have done a better job on that. This is going to be perfectly fine. It doesn't really matter if we're getting closer to 1/8 of an inch somewhere or a little bit less than 1/8 of an inch somewhere and we're closer to 1/4 of an inch. This is just kind of what's happening as we apply the tape. It could be some minor inconsistencies of when we glued and clipped or applied double-sided tape and folded over those edges, or it could have, the double-sided tape could have lifted when we applied the tape and it sunk in a little bit, or it pushed out a little bit. Maybe we pulled too hard. There's some inconsistencies, but I have sewn, I think I'm at 25 or 24 donut holes, if not more than that, with this video. And I will tell you that even if your zipper seems kind of wonky from this side and perfect from this side, unless you did anything something crazy with your zipper application, as long as it's within 1/8 of an inch of application all the way around, it's going to turn out just fine. You're not going to see any of these inconsistencies that you may see here in the finished result. It's not going to give you a wavy zipper. We already have the most taut zipper we can have with this situation, and it really will turn out just fine. So don't stress too much about this. I will always tell you when you need to stress about something. This is not that scenario. So obviously we have all of these thread tails that we don't want to be hanging out. So we're going to pull all the threads to the wrong side. So now I'm going to knot each individual thread, right? So it'll be 4 corners with 4 knots. Then I'm going to pull each pair to the center and knot them in the center, just like we did here on this Royal Companion. If you did the Biscuit, it's not going to be the same as when you did this, because this time you started and stopped right in the middle. So you were going to knot these 2 pairs individually and then pull them together and knot them together just like you did here in the center, and put a piece of a little dab of glue on it and then trim it down. So I've already removed my basting stitch from my Royal Companion, but I haven't removed it yet from my Biscuit, so we're going to do that now. I still think that it's best to remove it a little bit earlier on, but if you wanted to wait just to see what it looked like afterwards, then I did remove it from the other side, but you can see here is my basting stitch, and so I'm going to remove that now. Now you need to be mindful when you remove this, okay? Be careful of your materials because you are pulling out a strong thread. So start out with that basting, the loose thread, right? The basting, what was on the right side of the material. And that one should be nice and loose. And I'm using my little pliers here because they're not too sharp. And I'm just pulling it up whenever and wherever I can. Keep in mind though, that since we were sewing over some of it's going to get tangled in some threads too. And so it's going to be a lot harder to remove now. So that one's a little too tight, so I'm just going to snip it. I'm going to snip it down and it will be just fine. I'm going to use my needle. I'm going to poke it back in there. And that basting stitch is there to stay. I don't have to try and pull it out. All of the other ones have been removed. And I'm good to go. So before we move on, I'm sure some of you would like to see what it would look like. And so we're going to zip it up and just get a bit of a preview of what your little donut hole will look like once it's finished. So you want to fold your donut hole in half. This is going to be for either option. You're going to align those edges there. You're going to insert your zipper pull. Try to make it so that when you insert your zipper pull, the cut edge of your zipper is nice and flush like that. And then zip it all the way around and off. And then you can tuck these in. So this is your Royal Companion, and there is your Biscuit. So 2 options, very, very similar in size, as you can see. And they will be formed a little bit better up top once you get that lining in there. But even with those consistencies, pretty good looking zippers, I would say. And it's not poking out, it's not sinking in, it's doing all of what you want a nicely installed zipper to do. So that's why we go through all that hard work, because it gets us these. So for either option, the lining assembly is going to be the same. There's no changes except for that additional layer of stabilizer on the Royal Companion. So you'll only see me work on the Royal Companion option here, but it's going to be the exact same for either one. I am going to be adding a label a logo label here to the inside of my Royal Companion and on the Biscuit. So both linings are going to have a logo on there somewhere. Hopefully it aligns as nicely as that, but I will not hold my breath. And then some testers have put a woven tag in the middle of their wings when that is all said and done. It is a very small seam allowance, so you connect the wings at the end using an 1/8 inch seam allowance, and so I'm not sure if I'm going to do that or not. I'm going to try it and see how it works. This one is a cute one that says May Contain Cat Hair, and it comes from Lauren Mormino at mormino.com. Highly recommend their woven tags. So the lining assembly is going to start out very similar to how the full main panel was prepped for the Biscuit, and a combination of the techniques used in the Royal Companion. So we're going to do basting, right? So we're going to do some snipping actually into these curves here so that when we fold everything over, it'll expand. And we're going to do basting around these edges so that we can gather. And after we do basting, we're going to do notches around these rounded edges. Now, your seam allowance for this piece is, you have a lot more between the edge of the stabilizer and the edge of the material. And that's because when we combine everything and do the final assembly, we need to be able to catch this seam allowance in that stitching. And so that one is going to be 1/8 of an inch away from the exterior top stitching, which means it's technically a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So that means we just need ample amount of material here to be caught in a 1/4 inch seam allowance, hence the extra space. So I'm going to do all this snipping, I'm going to do my basting, and then I'm going to do my notching. And the big difference between the basting you did before and the gathering and the notches is that you just need to make it all a bit bigger this time. So your basting and your gathering seam allowance is going to be a 1/4 inch, and so are your notches. Your notches are going to be about a 1/4 inch and still around a 1/4 inch apart. Since I decided to use a white lining and a white background, I decided to swap out, to use my little felt pad here to hopefully help you better see what I did. And so I have done my snipping here. I've done my notches all around the edge. See, they're a bit bigger than the exterior. And I have my 1/4 inch there basting line all the way around. And so I actually didn't loosen my tension all that much on my domestic because I know how easy this is going to be to gather. So I am going to go ahead and gather just like we did on the exterior. If you wanted to use double-sided tape, you can do that. I'm going to do glue. So I'm going to gather. See how nice and easy that is. And this is Gutermann Tex 40. It's like Mara 70 or something like that. So that's what I use on my domestic. So it's still a strong thread. It's just not a thick bonded thread. And you see how nicely that gathers. And so I don't even have to do that much work down here like I had to do on the exterior to kind of get these bottom parts nicely gathered in. So I'm going to just knot that together right now. And now would be a good time to heat up your iron if you are using woven like me, or even honestly if you're using a ripstop or like a lightweight waterproof canvas, as I state in the pattern, because you can still press it nicely. And so now when I get done tying this knot, I am going to go and press these. And I know I don't say this in the pattern, but if you're already there and you're already pressing all this other stuff and you don't really want to put glue down and stuff yet, you can also see if you can press these in just a bit. And then when we apply glue or double-sided tape later, we can fully fuse and adhere that. So I'm going to go give this a good press and then we'll check back. All right, so I just got done pressing and trimming away these threads. You can see what a difference that makes, and especially if you're using woven, but especially with all that excess seam allowance, It really does just kind of make things a little bit easier to work with, and you don't see any of those puckers or anything like that from the right side of the lining panel. It's all on the back side, the wrong side, and you could even just leave your basting stitches in there. I'm actually going to do that, and truly, I don't think that you actually need to glue if you're going to leave your basting stitches in there and you're using woven like this and you've given it a good press. But I think it's a good idea just for fraying purposes, so I'm still going to do it. And in this area right here where you did your snips, you can either apply glue and clip, or you can do double-sided tape. So I'm also applying just a little bit of glue on top of that snip section. It is woven. It is snipped close to the edge. It will be sewn down, but I just feel better if I make sure that it is nice and secure and I don't have to worry about it. And so now I'm going to let this dry for a bit and we're going to focus on the wings. So for every wing, you're going to fold it so that the corner of the trimmed edge, both of those corners will match up with the opposing corner. You're going to fold it in half, right sides together, and you're going to clip it. So I know it's a little hard to see, but you will be now stitching using a 3/8 inch seam allowance from the top edge and from the bottom edge, and you're going to start at each folded edge and work your way to that inner corner of that trimmed edge. I know it's a little hard to see there, but you don't want to sew into this non-trimmed edge where it's just a single layer. You want to stay just where the 2 layers are, okay? So you want to back stitch at the start and stop, and don't sew into this single layer, okay? So now that we have sewn all of those 4 seams, we're going to trim each seam allowance down to about 1/4 or 1/8 of an inch. I'm actually going to do just a little bit less or a little bit more than that because of my material. Because like I said, it does fray a little bit, and so I want to just be a little bit more mindful and not snip so close to my seam like I would do if I was using something like ripstop or a more tightly woven material. So now for each one of these wings, you're going to turn it right side out, and you're going to want to poke out all those corners. And I'm going to use my tool, and I'm going to show you how I use my tool to get the best corner. A lot of people tend to poke at an angle to directly point their corner. They point their tool directly into the corner to try and get a nice edge. What I find that does is it pushes the seam allowance, it bunches the seam allowance and pushes it up into the corner. Then you have a bulge, and I am not okay with bulges in my makes. So I instead will insert my tool parallel and then pull up. And what that does is that puts the seam allowance directly down. It puts pressure parallel to the seam, and it forces the seam allowance to go where I want it to go. And now I have a nice corner, and that is what we're going for. So that is what I do every time. I always get nice corners with this technique. If you want to jab your tool in your wings and make it bulky and have that bulge, more power to you. And then when we're all done, we're going to give this a good press. So Essex linen is one of those materials that really holds a press very nicely, but if you have something that doesn't, you can always use something like a tailor's ham, and as soon as you're done pressing it, you would then put this on there and just let it cool. These are stuffed with sawdust and I suppose other things, and it just allows the heat to cool very slowly, and so it helps retain that press even better. And so you could use a clapper. I don't have one of those, but you could also just place like a yard of fabric that you fold up, and as soon as you're done pressing it, put that on top of your wing and let it cool that way. It's just you kind of want to insulate it a little bit so that it cools a little bit more slowly and again retains those creases. Again, this is a little hard to see because of the material, but if you'll see here, this is the seam allowance. So here's our edge of that trimmed edge, and here's a seam allowance that's kind of poking out. It's folded back on itself. We don't necessarily want to fully cut that off because we do need a little bit of that to be on there. So what we're going to do is we're going to angle our scissors in, and we're just going to snip and follow the curve of the trimmed edge, and only until the material is at that fold. So, okay, I don't know if you can see there. That way you can fold it out. Okay, so do that for each wing. And then while your iron's still hot, you can press these nice and flat or not. I am going to press them. So now our wings have wings, yo dog. So we are going to now snip some notches along this edge here. This is the single layer of material, the non-trimmed edge. So I like to snip and make this, turn that into a part of a notch. And then I just continue making notches all down this edge. So I've got my wings notched. So now we're going to draw some lines. So I want you to extend these lines that you drew in your prep work, and I want you to use the pattern instructions to draw another line that's going to be closer to these edges and fully across. And that's going to give us reference lines for where to place the wings and where to apply our double-sided tape. If you have the 3D printed templates, you can always align it with those two center lines you drew, and you can trace this edge here and trace this edge here, and you don't have to measure anything. So now that you have those lines drawn, I want you to apply 1/8 inch double-sided tape between every set of lines right along that edge of that folded edge of your material. So now you're going to take all of your wings and you're going to apply them, just kind of lay them on top of your lining panel with the longer edge towards the top and this shorter edge down here closer towards the center. And they should be opposite from one another, like this, right? So both short edges should be pointing towards the center. So we're only going to be working with 1/2 of our wings at a time. So I'm going to take these two and put them aside. And for these two, I'm just going to give it a temporary little clip just so I can make sure that I'm not putting the wrong one on the wrong orientation. And then I'm going to flip my work over. And so now I'm going to hold it in place, and I just remove the clip, and I'm going to align this edge, this bottom sewn edge with that first line, and this top sewn edge with that second line. And you should see that your lining, that trimmed edge should sit really nicely with that folded edge, just like that. And so get both sides properly clipped into place. And now I'm going to remove this double-sided tape backing, and now that I have it in place, I can remove my clips because I'm comfortable holding it. And then you just want to start folding and kind of easing it all together as you go, right onto that double-sided tape. Just make sure that you can get as much of that adhered as possible so that it looks nice and smooth from the front. And then if you want, you can further clip. I'm going to do the same on the other side. And so now that we have everything adhered, we're going to start from this very top edge, or the bottom, it doesn't really matter, but you're going to top stitch using an 1/8 inch seam allowance from the top of one wing all the way down to the bottom of the other. Now I like to do this and just back stitch neatly. I'm not too worried about it. But one thing to keep in mind, and a couple testers have brought this up, so the way that the donut hole is designed, the lining is not only shorter, but also smaller. As a result, and I did that because in some other patterns where you install things like this, if your lining is the same size as your exterior and you're adding on wings, then it creates a bulge of the wing, and then your zipper can run into it constantly. And so if you're using even something like ripstop, you kind of need to account for that. And so I accounted for that by shrinking it just a little bit. And so because of that, the radius of this corner of this circle, or the circumference of this circle, whichever, math was never my strong suit, is smaller. And so when we stitch this round shape and this round shape, it's going to be different than the contoured top stitching we're going to do on our exterior, right? So even though we will top stitch this one 1/8 of an inch in from this stitch line, it's still not the same shape as what this is going to be. So you're going to have a little bit where your stitches may be a little bit further apart up top and then a little closer together down here when you do your final top stitch. It doesn't bother me, but if that bothers you, use a matching thread or something like that. If it's something that really bothers you, then using all the same color materials on your lining and using a matching thread color for your lining is a way to kind of blend all that in so you don't have to kind of stress about that. It doesn't bother me, but it may bother you. So that's what it should look like, fully top stitched. We caught all of our notches and all of our wings in our top stitching, as well as that snipped edge. And then we're going to repeat that process for the other 2 wings, again making sure they're properly oriented. And then we're going to do a little bit of fray management on these corners. Full disclosure, it is the next day, so in case my lighting is off for some reason, or you notice any changes, that is why I cannot do a full tutorial in a single day, as much as I would love to. But I did go ahead and get that second set of wings on, and time for some movie magic. I also did my second lining. So this one will be for my Royal Companion, and this one will be for my Biscuit. I also got my labels sewn on. So now we're going to press a crease into each wing, and this one, this is the way that I do it. I am sure there are probably easier ways, but this just works for me, and so I'll show you how I do that. So this is an 1.25 inch wide ruler, and so I'm going to use this 1/4 inch line here that runs down the bottom, and I'm going to align that with each corner of my wing. So you can see that this line hits that corner and this line is going to hit that corner. And then what I will do is I'll fold in this straight edge to meet that edge of my ruler, just like that. And then you can pin it, you can clip it. I'm going to clip it at the top and the bottom. And I like to kind of press this little section here with the tip of my iron and then press the whole thing, and then I can just kind of go around each wing and do that. So I will do this on all of my wings for both of my lining pieces, and then I will show you what we do next. So now you can see I have both linings with all of my wings pressed, and I did use my little tailor hand to make sure that they will stay. So it's kind of like a memory crease. And then now, because this is we're going to be sewing this whole lining piece onto the exterior, we need to make sure that these wings, even though they're creased, we want to make sure that they are pinned out of the way so that we don't have to worry about them being in the way of our seam allowance for that top stitching. So the way that I do it is to just pin them flat. I take the pin and I just, do my best to pin them together. But the important part is to have this head of the pin here at the top of your work, or at the top of one of the rounded edges. You don't want it towards the bottom because we're going to be top stitching down there, and that head of the pin is probably going to be enough to cause a bump, and it can really interfere with your top stitching. And so it's just best to keep it up here and out of the way, and you shouldn't have an issue. But one more thing before we move on to the final assembly is we know that I used Essex linen here, but also if you're using something even like ripstop, where you're making all of these kind of notches into your lining and there's a chance that there's a bit of fraying or some loose threads that are maybe on just below this folded edge. If you're using something like ripstop, you can always go through and melt it slightly with your lighter, but I'm using something that frays rather easily, so I could use fray check or I could use glue in this situation. So I'm going to use glue on this backside and do fray check here in these corners where we did that snipping. So first I'm going to just place a little dab of fray check on every little corner. I'm going to set this aside, let it dry, let that glue set for a little bit, and then we'll move on to the final assembly. For the final assembly, you will need your main panel, your lining panel, your number 5 zipper pull, and your connector hardware if you haven't installed it already. So the final assembly does require quite a bit more finessing than any of the previous constructions steps we have done for the donut holes so far. And the reason for that is because, as I've said before, the lining is not only shorter, it's also smaller. And so you need to try and center it and offset the lining just enough that it will sit inside of the lining while still being straight. And so that does involve, again, some finessing. So this is going to be something that your first donut hole you're going to need to play around with to get a feel for it first, and then your second donut hole you'll feel way more confident. So I'm going to walk you through that mainly with the Royal Companion because it is the exact same process between the two construction versions. Now the only caveat to that is that this is a pieced version compared to this being a single version, or single piece, right? So there is a chance that this piece of yours may end up shorter or slightly longer than your biscuit. Either way, it's not going to impact the final result. That is going to be from a variety of factors, and I'll explain that. So when you're piecing together 3 pieces, not only do you need to accommodate material thickness, but not only once, twice, right? Because we're folding material around a stabilizer. So if you're making 2 Royal Companions and you're using one with a thicker material than the other, unless you're accommodating for all of that in every line that you draw, your thicker material Royal Companion will be slightly longer. Not to mention, it depends on what you do when you draw your lines. When you're drawing your reference lines, are you accommodating the pen width or are you not? When you sewed it on, was there any shifting? Anything like that. A lot of those things will come into play, but it has been designed and it has been configured so that that minor shift of about 1/8 of an inch in height difference will not impact your overall construction or your end results. So don't stress too much if you're making a whole batch and you might see some minor differences. Just make it work for the actual donut hole that you are constructing in that moment and you'll be just fine. The first thing we're going to do is flip this zipper tape up so that it's pointing towards the exterior so that it's fully out of the way. And then you want to apply some double-sided tape along the stabilizer. Now I'm using 1/4 inch. You can use thicker double-sided tape. I don't recommend using 1/8 inch tape. You really want something that's going to hold it and not allow it to shift. So the thicker your double-sided tape, the better here. And I'm going to remove the double-sided tape backings from what I am calling my front. Then I'm going to start by kind of eyeballing a bit of a gap between the edge of my lining and the zipper tape. And I'm going to make sure that it is aligned with those 2 center lines are aligned there. And I'm going to double check on the other side too, because I want to make sure that it's straight. Not only is it aligned on one side, but it's aligned on the other, because we can't see that far into the attachment once it's starting to be adhered to that double-sided tape. So remember earlier I said that not only is it shorter, but it's also smaller. What you need to do for this one is that shortness is meant to be in the center of your donut hole. It's not meant to be from the top down drastically. You're supposed to kind of center that shortness here in this center area. Around each half of the donut hole, though, you should have a mostly equal gap between the edge of the lining and the edge of the zipper tape here. So what we're looking for is a gap between your lining and your zipper tape that is around 1/16 of an inch. So if you're using your ruler, you're gonna want it to be just under 1/8 of an inch or so. Let's see if I can show this on camera. See that? And so you just need to take some time and adjust so that it's also even. This honestly seems really good to me. And so a good way to double check from this point on is that I want to flip it over. Now there's another thing that we're going to be looking for when it comes to our zipper tape, okay? What we want is we want to make sure that when we put our our lining in and we fold our zipper tape down, we don't want our lining to push up against the zipper tape. So if your lining is looking closer to that, so your zipper tape is reaching further out than your exterior, then you need to move your lining in slightly. See how it goes ever so slightly out from my top stitching? That's fine. I don't want it to be taller than the exterior fold here. So now that we have I'm happy with the placement here, I'm going to flip my zipper tape back up. And so now I just find some way to clip my zipper tape out of the way. I'm sure there are wonderfully easy ways that I'm not consistent with it. I just play with it every time. And before we sew, just go and do a double check of everything now that it's clipped. See how you feel about that placement. Make sure that your pins is still secure in your wings and that it's pointing from the top down. Double check the center line. See how that is fitting. See how that feels. So now that we have everything aligned, we're going to top stitch this main panel here. And so we're going to start by putting your needle in the center of the top. So along this straight edge, pivot and then sew around. Pivot and then end in your initial stitch line hole. It's going to be the exact same for the biscuit. A couple things to keep in mind here is that we don't have a huge jump in bulk throughout these seams here. We do have, though, an increase in density. So that's where you needed to keep in mind all of your material choices for the machine you have. So I'm going to go do this final top stitch. I will bring you to the machine with me. And there is my final stitch meetup, which is a little bit better than having normal stitch and then a tiny stitch. See how that's a little bit more distracting than that? So now I'll take you back to the table and we'll take a look. So there is my final top stitch for this side. It's not perfect. I'm not trying to be perfect while I'm doing a video tutorial because that feels a little impossible, but it is pretty good and I am pretty happy with it. So now let's look at the other side, the wrong side, the lining side. So you can see that because we have this slightly smaller lining, this curve is not the same as this final top stitching curve. Also, if your lining is shifted slightly one way or the other, for a variety of reasons, right? You're dealing with a circle. It's very hard to get everything perfectly centered. It's okay. It's not the end of the world. I did manage to not, I suppose, sew my wings on perfectly even with one another, so it is slightly crooked there. Not a big deal. You're not going to notice that when you have it finally installed like that. No one's going to see that difference. For this seam, I like to just tie them together here and then feed them through the two layers, the lining and the exterior. So now that I've tied those two sets of thread tails together, I'm going to pull my lining, or pull that thread tail knot down slightly so I can see the hole where the two meet in the center. I'm going to insert my hand sewing needle in that hole and then slide it through in between the lining and the exterior, just like that. And then I will feed my thread tails through it. Do your best to bury that knot. The downside to this is that you will have a little bit more noticeable of a hole there. You can steam and work this down to a smaller hole most of the time, but not always depending on your materials, but it does make sure that that knot is never going to come out, and so that's the benefit of doing that. And from the right side, looks perfectly seamless. So I'm going to increase the speed for getting this biscuit, the first side of this biscuit sewn together. I'll show you me stitching it at the machine, and then we'll meet back up and we will take both of these, both versions, and adhere the second side and then get those sewn up. And then we are almost done. I had a slight little jump here that I'm not happy about. So I'm going to rip out my stitches and redo. So what I'm going to do is I'm only going to pull out to here. I'm going to start my needle hole, my stitching again in this first stitch, and then continue on and just see what I get. There is my final top stitch for this side of the biscuit, and so I'll show you how I handle that break in my stitching there, and I will bury this knot as well. So it is never ideal to have a big kind of jump in your stitching, a one crooked stitch compared to everything else, and I am not a fan of that, as most people are not. And so if something like that happens to you, you can just be very aware of your stitches while you're stitching. Keep an eye on them. That way, if you're like me and you stitch about an inch out and you catch it, then you can just go back just that amount of stitches. And then what I did was I pulled out my stitches until one stitch before, well, I would say technically 2 stitches before. I don't know if you can see that tiny little needle hole right there. that is where my presser foot jumped a little bit. So I went back to 2 stitches before that, and I just started again. And you can see that is the only little needle hole that is visible because the rest of my stitching was correct. I just had one go out and back in. And so now with that, I kind of need to treat it just like I would where the stitches meet up for the beginning and end of the seam, but I just need to do it here on this edge. Here's my needle holes on the lining side. It's not too bad. You can't really tell that I restitched over that, so that's nice. So I'm going to do the same thing as I did on the Royal Companion. I'm going to insert my needle into the hole where those stitches kind of line up. Okay, that was a struggle because one of my threads was mostly frayed out. So I'm now going to push this through here and pull it out the other side. I need my pliers. So that is my hole right there where that knot went through. That knot is sitting right there. Went through all those layers of everything, and now I'm going to trim it down there. And so all the evidence is now that little tiny hole. So now I'm going to do where I'm going to knot these 2 threads together, bury it between these 2 layers, place a little dab of glue there, and then we'll work on attaching the other side to both this Biscuit and the Royal Companion. So there we have our Royal Companion first side sewn and our Biscuit first side sewn. So now when it comes to adhering this second side, you're going to essentially repeat the entire process. The difference is now when you do that, you're going to have a bulge in this center area because, again, we know that this is shorter. So I'm going to start with the Biscuit here. I'm going to remove that double-sided tape backing. And now I'm going to pull it so that I have about the same distance from the lining to the edge of the folded or to the edge of that folded zipper tape there. Alright, so this Biscuit attachment feels nice. I'm going to press everything to adhere. Then I'm going to just kind of give it a close little close and just see how everything looks. Double check everything. I'm going to fold my zipper tape down and double check my placement here. Does not reach higher than the exterior. Everything looks like it will align really nicely. Okay, that feels close enough for me. I'm confident in that. So I'm going to make sure all of my zipper tape is pointing up towards the exterior so that we can sew it without any interference on the bed of our machine. Want to clip the excess zipper tape closer to the other side. So now we're going to repeat the same process on this side. Again, take your time, be mindful of the bulk, be mindful of the changes in density here when we hit that those wings. So I'm going to go sew both of these and then I'll meet you back here. I'm sure many of you really wanted to see me do that final top stitch, but I can't tell you how nice it was to not be on camera while doing that. It was so much faster. They're not perfect, never will be, and that is okay with me. I'll pull these down so you can see from the exterior. There we go. And so now for both of these, we're going to pull those thread tails all to that lining, knot them, and then we're going to bury them. But the difference between burying this time versus last time is that we're going to need to angle our needle to exit out of that hole right there. So you can see I have all my thread tails pointing through that hole just like we did before, and now it is pointing out to the side. And I'm going to use my pliers just to ease it through. So at this point, you are ready to install your zipper pull. All of your thread tails have been taken care of. I have removed my needles from my wings here just so I don't poke myself in any of this process going forward. And so just like we did at the end of the zipper installation, or you may not have done, but if you did, we're going to install the zipper pull again. And so I am going to, the first thing I'm going to do is match up my two edges and just see how that looks on the, with the spots that we started and stopped stitching on that zipper installation. I'm going to see if that is even. And so I'm going to see how that feels. Does it feel like it's off one way or the other? It doesn't. And a good giveaway of that is how your zipper tape behaves when it's sitting like this. Does it go straight out? If it does, then more than likely everything is nice and even. And so when you install your zipper fully in a couple steps, then everything will be nice and even there. So this is what we're not going for. See how it's off? That's off by technically 2 coils, and so I'm going to remove it. All right, I'm fine with that. So once you're happy with your results here, you need to reinsert your zipper pull and move it towards the center of the bottom of your pouch. Now, if you had to offset your coils by 1, you need to make sure that you maintain that when you reinsert your zipper pull now. See that nice even gap coming off of that zipper pull? That is what you want. If you see this gap more on one side than the other, then it is crooked. So I have both zipper pulls installed and pushed towards the center of the rounded sections. And now I'm going to trim down these lengths here by about 7/8 of an inch to an inch. So now that I've trimmed all those zipper tape edges down, I'm going to go and remelt them just to make my life easier. So now for every end of your zipper tape, you're going to apply some double-sided tape along the right and wrong side of each half, okay? So 4 pieces of double-sided tape for every end of your zipper. So I've got all my double-sided tape applied. It's about 3/4 of an inch long, maybe a little bit longer in some spots. And so I know this is a little confusing, a little hard to see in the pattern, so I'm just going to show you and hope that the red shows a little bit better. But we're going to go to the wrong side of one corner and we're going to remove this edge here, this double-sided tape backing. Then we're going to fold it right back on itself, just like this. I'm not using my super strong double-sided tape for this. I'm going to make sure I get a good adhesion. And then I'm going to remove this double-sided tape backing, and this one is from the right side of my zipper tape, and I'm going to fold it again one more time, and this is going to put it really close to the center of the wrong side of the coils. And that's what we're going to do for every edge of the zipper tape, okay? Oh, maybe I should have used my stronger double-sided tape. Okay, and so now that I have that, I'm going to place a little clip to hold it, and because my double-sided tape isn't really cooperating really well, I am going to also melt this down to help hold that fold there. See how much I melted that down? It's really going to hold that, even if some of the other parts kind of come unstuck because of the double-sided tape that I'm using. But the goal is to gather them in a more centered fashion so that it doesn't overlap on one side and not the other. It's equally gathered there, and that is what I'm going for. So one of the testers brought up a good point, and this was added very close to the end of the testing process to the pattern, is that if you want some practice getting your zipper tape installed, because if you haven't sewn a pattern like this, it might not, you might need some time just figuring out kind of how to maneuver it, smush it in there and all that stuff. You may want to practice this without putting glue in here first. And so I will just show you that now without any glue. So you could use something like anything really just to get in there and separate the spine area from the lining from the exterior. So you can see I now have a gap in there. And you really want to just start poking it in there. So I've got them in there, and then because the lining is not pressing up against it, it's sinking in. So I'm going to open up my zipper pouch. And so normally if I would have put glue in there, then I would then push that lining up against it, and then just see what happens when I start to close it. Now there's still a little bit of a gap there, and we have some maybe undesirable results when it comes to the zipper. So how do we fix that? Well, it's really up to you on what kind of tool you want to use. I typically use like a flathead screwdriver that I put somewhere and I'm not sure where. So I'm going to use my pliers here, and I'm just going to continue to push this in as far as it will go. And then as it's kind of pushed in there, and normally that tacky glue would start to hold it, I'm going to ever so slightly pull this out and smooth out any wrinkles that may want to occur there. And that smoothing of the wrinkles with the glue, if your glue was applied so that enough of it is kind of starting to hit closer to the edges, then you're starting to get that nice edge of your zipper. And then on this side, so it's a little harder on this side where you don't have your zipper pull there, holding everything nice and taut, putting pressure on things, and preventing separation from happening. Once you start to get a little bit of that separation on this side, it is a little bit more finicky. So for the zipper pull, it is a little bit in the way, so I tend to zip it up just a little bit further so I can actually see what I'm working with. And then I'll go in there with a flathead screwdriver or pliers or hemostats, which is what Nikki Kinder, one of my testers, likes to use and suggests. And we just start putting everything in there, pushing it in, moving it in, just kind of manipulating it enough to get where we need it to go. So here's my flathead, and I like to just insert it there in between those folds and just continuously push it in. And that way it does give a nicer finish. This is something that's going to take you a couple of minutes every time. I don't care how many times you've done it. It's still going to take some time and some finesse getting it where you want it. So I'm going to do all that with glue now. So this is another reason why tacky glue is so important. If you're holding this thing vertically and you put a bunch of glue in here and it's not tacky glue, then it's going to drip all over the place. So once you're happy and you think that you've got your zipper tape placed and smoothed out as much as you can. This took me probably 3 or 4 minutes at minimum to get to this point. It takes a lot of manipulation and a lot of playing with it. Then I want you to hold it closed like this for about a minute. I guess I could cue the elevator music. And so now I've held it for about a minute. That's really going to help set that tacky glue a little bit further. I'm going to zip it closed. I'm going to see how everything looks. If I am happy with how my zipper is laying, I'm going to let it be. I'm going to let it sit. And I'm not going to touch it for about 20 minutes. And that's going to allow that glue to fully set. And once that's done, I can then sew up my wings and essentially be done with my make. And so I'm going to set that 20-minute timer for me now. I'm going to do this one, eat my lunch, and then we'll see how I did. So now I'm going to hold it for that minute and just make any adjustments after that. Alright, so I am going to let this sit here. I'm going to let that glue set. I'm going to let it dry, make it be as happy as it can. You see how the zipper tape really doesn't go that much further than these spine areas. You want it to kind of meet the spine. It's a little bit different here, but there's on the Royal Companion, just because, you know, there's a lot more going on, but it should still look nice once it's finished. All right, after a nice yummy lunch, I'm happy to say that everything is nice and happy in there. And my glue has been set. And now all I need to do is sew my wings together and attach my D-ring hardware. So I'm going to pull my wings out of each donut hole and match them together and clip. So I've got both pairs of wings clipped here. And what you will do is you're going to just go to your machine and you're going to stitch along this edge here using a 1/8 inch seam allowance. Now I suggest starting from the top edge, or what could be considered the bottom edge of your wing, just so that you can get your foot placed on there, get your needle inserted, and it's just easier to work towards this skinnier end than it is to do it in the reverse. So you can see I have the wings sewn here. I have backstitched them and trimmed down my threads. And so the last thing we need to do is attach your hardware if you haven't already. I hope it wasn't too bad for you. I know that that last section has a lot of fiddling and finessing that needs to happen, but I hope that you are happy with your donut holes. I bet you thought that this little pouch tutorial video was not going to be over 2.5 hours long. I also did not think it was going to take that long, but here we are. So a couple more things. Spoiler alert, I forgot to put in the woven tags that I said I would for the lining, but here we are. It's fine. It's fine. It's fine. I also wanted to touch on the material choices for the lining. If you recall at the beginning of the video, I did say that I was curious how these fabrics would hold up or how they would work. Since the lining material, the heart fabric, was a bit lightweight, and I know that Essex linen frays rather easily sometimes in the right situation, so I wanted to see how it would behave on the wings. I had no issues with the Essex linen, just simply doing all the stitches we did and using the glue for the and the fray check, no issues there. But I will say that that's quilting cotton is just not the best quality that I could have used, so I would say just try to be at bare minimum a good quality quilt cotton, and then you can go up from there, but only up to ripstop. As I had said in the material list, you really don't want to bulk up those wings or the lining too much because that final top stitch is going to be way too dense for most machines. And last but not least, my final opinion on glue versus double-sided tape. I think that my favorite combination is glue on the exterior, the right amount with the right kind of glue, right? For me, I want my Beacon 3-in-1 to be a little bit old, and I want that on my exterior. I like my Wawak 1/8 inch for my zipper application, and I also do like the Wawak 1/8 inch double-sided tape for the lining as well. Those are all my preferences, and then of course if I'm using woven, then I will use my glue to make sure that everything, all those snipped and notched edges stay nice and intact forever. So I hope that answers any lingering questions, and I hope you enjoyed sewing your donut holes. So get back out there and sew, sew, sew.